And today we will discuss about the Spike book, The Virus versus the People, the Inside Story. I'm Nigalu Purwanti, the Master of Ceremony on this event. On behalf of the organizing committee, we extend our appreciation for your presence today. Ladies and gentlemen, now we are moved to the webinar agenda. This presentation will be delivered by the speaker, and Sir Jeremy James Farrar, about the Spike book, The Virus versus the People, the Inside Order of the British Empire, Fellows of the Royal College of Physicians, Fellowship of the Royal Society, Fellowship of the Academy of Medical Science, British medical researcher and director of the Wellcome Trust since 2013. Previously was a professor of tropical medicine at the University of Oxford. The discussion of this event is Dr. Gindo Tampubolon, Master of Science, Doctor of Philosophy, Fellow of the Royal Statistics Society, RMS, Deputy Director, Rory and Elizabeth Brooks, Doctoral College, University of Manchester. And also, this agenda will be guided by Dr. Riris Andono Ahmad, Master of Public Health, Doctor of Philosophy, Director of Center of Tropical Medicine in Gajah Mada University. So, without any further ado, to Dr. Doni, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mbak Galuh. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, Sir Jeremy, Pak Gindo. I hope you are in a very good condition today. And we are very honored to have you here. And to all the participants, welcome. We have a very distinguished guest this afternoon. And we will discuss about a very, very interesting and enlightening book about how COVID pandemic reveal globally. The title is Spike, the Virus versus the People. And we are very honored to have Sir Jeremy as the author to tell the story of the books and give us a lot of insight and a lot of new knowledge, I think, about how the pandemic reveal in the world. When I read this book, I feels like this is like an action movie. When I see an action movie, but at the same time, I feel that this is like behind the scenes a movie where through Sir Jeremy works, we can see how the virus revealed and the pandemics began from Wuhan to spread throughout the world. And later, I think we will have Dr. Gindo as the discussant. Then he will give his review and also insight about also this book. And because Sir Jeremy only I've been informed that you only be able to be here for about 45 minutes. I hope I changed a bit about the time allocation. So first, Sir Jeremy will tell about the book in about 15 minutes, and then Dr. Gindo will discuss about the book also, and then another around 10 minutes, and then we will have around 15 minutes discussion with Sir Jeremy and with the audience. I hope we will finish the discussion at 4 o'clock. And thank you again, Sir Jeremy. I think the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm still very nervous about these virtual calls. Can you just let me know you can hear and see me?
Yes, you're loud and clear, Jeremy.
Okay, great. So thank you very, very much indeed. I'm It's 8:15 in the morning here. I'm on a visit to Glasgow University in Scotland. Yesterday I was at the University of Manchester, and now I'm talking with colleagues in Indonesia. It's a remarkable thing to say, and a great pleasure. I haven't been in Indonesia for many years, since about 2012. I just hope that in 2022 or 2023 we can make that happen. And of course, you're very welcome, if you are in London, to come and see us at the Wellcome Trust in London. I hope we can get back to a normal way of life as soon as possible. Again, thank you very much for the invitation to join you and discuss both the pandemic and perhaps a lesser extent the book. The situation of the pandemic, I think, remains very troubling still. As I sit here in the UK, in terms of community transmission, 1 in 30 people, 1 in 25 people in the community today is infected. That's a remarkable thing to say, 2 years and 2 months into the pandemic. And the reason I say that is because I think that we are still underestimating the power of nature, the power of evolution, and the power of infectious diseases to dominate our lives. And we've made that mistake many times over the last 20 years, but particularly the last 2 years. We've had a degree of arrogance, and we've had a lack of humility, that we cannot be sure what the future will hold. And I think as a result, we have not always taken the most wise, sensible decisions. So really this book, it tries to document some of that. Not everybody will agree. It's one person's perspective. I'm sure there are elements in it which are incorrect interpretations, but I hope it's at least one person's perspective, with my colleague writing it, of Dr. Anjana. But I hope it's one person's perspective, both about the pandemic and with a focus on the UK decision-making. It's an insight in decision-making with a singular aim that in an era when I believe we will face more frequent and more troubling crises as a world, that we can perhaps learn some lessons from the last 2 years, the last 20 years, and that we can be both better prepared and better able to respond to these crises. Because if one does not learn from history, I'm afraid one is bound to repeat it. And that lessons from history are often painful and often difficult. But I think if you do not try and record what happened, at least in one person's perspective, then I'm afraid history will often get rewritten in years to come, as it so often does. So it is in that spirit that the book was written. I also think that writing down history as it's being made, if you like, is very important. 5 years from now, our memories of what has happened will be different. They'll be shaped by events of the next 5 years, and we will put the last 2 years in the context of that 5-year period. And I think emotionally, intellectually, and in all sorts of ways, we need to at least write down our thinking, our feelings, our emotional state, our intellectual state as we go through. Otherwise, I fear that we may rewrite history in a way if we leave it too long to write. The third thing I'll say before perhaps talking more specifically about the book is the last 2 years really have been one of those moments in humanity when history is truly made. Many of you on this call, and certainly myself as somebody working in public health, infectious diseases, global health, remembers, or not remembers, but looks back at the influenza pandemic of 1918, and 100 years later, still debate it, still debate its origins. Was it in west of Europe? Was it in Midwest America? Where did the virus actually come from? How has it evolved since? What disruption did it cause? What illnesses did it cause? How did it kill people? What happened to immunity after people were infected? What happened in the subsequent years? How did it disrupt society? How did it disrupt people's daily lives? What did people do to reduce its impact? Those are all questions which remain debated today of an event that was 100 years ago. And it will be true of this pandemic as well. I believe that in 100 years, when I suspect none of us will be here, there will be people debating this pandemic, of decisions that were made, of warnings that were ignored, of science. And of course, science will have moved on in 100 years, and we will know far more than we do today. But it will be one of those moments that we live through when epoch moments of history are created. And when I look back, I read history books of 1918. Although I appreciate the horror of 1918, that probably 20 to 30 million people in the world died in 1918 of influenza, when the world's population was 2.7 billion people. When I read those history books, though, I have a sense of a sort of almost romantic notion of living through the influenza pandemic, of people working together. And you forget the horrors. The truth is that when you do live through, as history is made, it's always painful. People lose loved ones. We all have people we know that were ill. We know how education and economics and jobs and opportunities have been limited through the pandemic. And as I say, far, far too many people have lost their lives. Probably, I think, the best accurate so far of the loss of life during the pandemic of COVID is somewhere between 16 and 20 million people already have died of COVID-19 over the last 2 years. That's a staggering thing to say in the context of the 21st century. So that was the spirit of writing the book. It tries to document, with all its flaws and all my own flaws, it tries to document an honest and transparent account of what happened from the very early days of the 31st of December 2019, when I first became aware of an unusual cluster of severe pneumonia cases in Wuhan in China, all the way through to actually with a recent release of the paperback this week, events of the last few months. But the original book released last year goes up to the first 18 months or so of the epidemic. It is a book for a general audience. It is not. It does not try to be a scientific book. I'm not a virologist, so the information about the basic science is at my level, or it's aimed not at a scientific audience. It's not a textbook. It is more a personal and at times emotional account of what at least one person was going through. And then before I hand back to for a discussion, I'd just like to frame where I think the pandemic is. I think I lived in Southeast Asia. I lived in Vietnam for 18 years between 1995 and 2013, and worked with many colleagues in Indonesia during that time, in Jakarta and Yogyakarta and Makassar and many other parts of Indonesia. I believe that over that 20-year period, 1999 to 2019, the world was given many, many warnings that because of the nature of the way we live, that epidemics and pandemics were going to become more frequent and more complex. We had H5N1, which Indonesia suffered from. We had SARS-1. We had the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. We had Ebola, that was a very different outbreak in 2014. We had Zika. We, of course, had the spread of dengue to new communities. And we had H1N1 in 2009. And that doesn't include all of them by any means. And I think the essence of all of that is that we live in a period that, because of ecological change in land use, environment change, climate change, and of course, the world lives in very different ways in huge cities now of 10, 20, 30 million people, which can be amplifying places. We've changed the nature of the interaction between animals and humans. And of course, almost all, if not all, emerging infections come from the animal sector across into humans. And then, of course, we travel around the world, or it did before COVID, in 12 or 24 hours. And so therefore, an infection can spread globally. Those are all features: land use, climate, urbanization, trade and travel, animal, human health. Those are all features that we will live in throughout this century. And I think those are the key drivers. And in essence, COVID or SARS-1 or bird flu or MERS, these are symptoms of a deeper, wider set of drivers. And if we just address the symptom without trying to impact on the drivers, then I'm afraid we will face more frequent and more complex pandemics. The second thing I'd say is that when you have an event such as this, there are four circles that it impacts on. There is the direct health consequences that you will all have felt in Indonesia and may still well be feeling. We've certainly felt here in the UK with people needing hospital care, the direct health consequences. But there is then a second circle, which is the indirect consequences: people with cancer, diabetes, people who need surgery, childhood vaccinations, maternal health, mental health. None of these health services in any country has been able to deliver its services as well as it would like to do. So the indirect health consequences are very significant, with many people not being able to get cancer care or having surgery postponed. And then the third circle is the economic disruption, disruption to education, to trade, to countries' debt levels, to inflation indeed. So there is a third circle of economics, which can be even more disruptive, particularly in low and middle income countries and in vulnerable populations. So the third circle is actually perhaps an even longer lasting disruption than the direct health consequences themselves. And then the fourth circle, I would say, are geopolitics. The tensions between East and West, and increasingly North and South, because and driven by the pandemic and the resulting scar on humanity of the inequitable access to vaccines and treatment and oxygen and personal protective equipment and therapeutics, is a stain on humanity. And I think that vaccine inequity will drive increasing fragmentation and tensions at a global level between countries, because when the world was affected by something all at the same time, and many politicians talked about with phrases like, "we're all in this together," the truth is, in 2021 in particular, vaccine inequity was an awful outcome. And as a result, I think we've increased fragmentation and we've increased tensions between and within countries because of that inequitable access to the benefits of science. So what we're bringing all of that together, I think that the issue is that pandemics are far more than just about the virus that causes them. They're about the origins of the virus. They're about our changing world. They're about the changing world we live in. When you have something as disruptive as this, whether it's influenza in 1918 or COVID in 2020, or indeed the plague of the Middle Ages, they will disrupt far more than just the health sector. They'll have an impact across the whole of society. And it is the whole of society's resilience and willingness to work together and distribute the tools that we have through science equitably that will define any country or any world's ability to come through the pandemic. And then the last thing I'll say is, I think the other lesson I've learned is that, and this is from a UK perspective, I'd be very interested in perspective from Indonesia. In a UK perspective, I think we've got to work very hard in the future about how society and communities engage with science, understand science, listen to science, make their own decisions about the quality of that science, and critically as well, how scientific advice is made into government, and how governments who have to balance many, many different features, not just the scientific or biomedical or health feature, but also the social and economic and impact on education and everything else. How do governments use advice? Who do they listen to? How do they listen? How can they take on complex scientific ideas and concepts like virology or evolution when they may not come from those backgrounds? How do you build a resilient and robust and sustainable scientific advice into government, which is trusted, which is honest, which is transparent, and which informs the decisions of policymakers without scientists making those decisions themselves? That's a complex interaction. I think it's a tension that exists probably in every country, certainly in the UK. And I think we have to think forward for the future, given that we will face more of these sorts of crises. How do we ensure that society and community can trust science? And how can we ensure that politicians and policymakers can use evidence and data and science in the best way to make the best decisions for their citizens? So I'll stop there, if that's okay. I hope I haven't gone on too long, but I'm delighted to stay on till 4 o'clock your time and be part of any discussion that is of interest. And so hand back to you, sir.
Thank you, Sir Jeremy. I think it has a very rich knowledge from where the pandemic started, the impact on the global life, be it in health, in economy, in politics, and also you really rightly said the inequity and also the resilience of the community will influence how can we deal and control the pandemic. And I think we will have a lot of discussion in this. And it's rightly 15 minutes, sir, so thank you. And I will ask Dr. Gindo to give his comment on this for around 10 minutes. The floor is yours, Doctor.
Thank you very much. I am very pleased to be here. I hope you can all hear me. Yeah? Okay. So, like I said, I'm very pleased to be here, not least because I still got my copy of the book. I don't know whether you can see. I have trouble seeing it myself. So I remember buying it on the 27th of January. I still have my receipt here from Waterstones, just before it closes at 9:16 in the evening. And I arrived at home at 9:30 and I finished it at 1:50 in the morning. And I sent a text straight away to the host of this proceeding, Professor Laksono, and said, "This is exciting. You guys should read this." And so kindly, Professor Laksono put this together. And it's very kind of you, Jeremy, to share with us. And I think I have one or two slides, but I'm not going to show it. I just pick up what you raised, Jeremy, here. And it resonates with what we have been doing. When I say we, myself and Laksono and the team at Gajah Mada over the last, I remember precisely, from 1st of March 2020. So this resonates with your point earlier about writing history as it happens. And just before we came on air, I shared with the host of this Zoom meeting the text WhatsApp message that I shared with Professor Laksono on the 1st of March 2020. Warning Indonesia about the impending doom. And just a bit of history, on the 2nd of March 2020, the president came on television and said, Indonesia has one case in Depok. I also had the chance to look back at what I wrote on that 1st of March, that fateful day. And the first thing I said there is something that you also elaborate a lot on in your last chapter and also in the last 2 minutes of your talk today, namely data, evidence, science, and policy. That's the first thing I remember, and the host still has a copy of that WhatsApp message. Data, evidence, science into policy. The importance of open and transparent data. Obviously, it was ignored. And the second thing that I think you emphasized in that book, and I just want to repeat that again, because it's still being ignored. How do we make science capacity inform policy making? Certainly not like what Indonesia is doing today, having a cosmetic surgery specialist informing the heart of COVID policy. You need a little bit more than that, I think. So I see some nodding from people in Indonesia because they know what does that exactly mean. But the point being, we need some epidemiologists, we need some virologists, with all due respect, maybe not cosmetic specialists. I think it's very important, partly because what Jeremy has been saying all along, this is not going to go away. The way we live now, the way we use and exploit the environment, the way we travel so easily across the globe, Vietnam, Manchester, Glasgow, Jakarta, this is not going to go away. So science capacity at the heart of government is very important to be thought through. And my last point, because I promised to be brief to allow colleagues from Indonesia to directly talk to a knighted scientist, Sir Jeremy, my last point is just to emphasize by repeating and bringing it to the level of Indonesia, the point that you mentioned, the penultimate point that you mentioned about vaccine inequity across countries. I remember exactly in this forum, 9th of December, 2020, I warned Indonesia and this forum that vaccine inequity within Indonesia is going to happen. So Indonesia will distribute vaccine unfairly. And I make the comparison between people in Borneo, Malaysia, the Dayak people in Borneo, and people in Kalimantan, the Dayak people in Kalimantan. They will have a highly inequitable access to vaccine. The northern side will have a lot more than the southern side. And I remember, because there's a YouTube, again, this is history in the making so that we do not forget, there's a YouTube recording. And I remember saying the consequences of that would be thousands of premature unnecessary deaths. My mistake was I should have said 100,000, because the number of deaths in Malaysia is in the order of less than 40,000. The number of deaths in Indonesia is in the order of more than 140,000. And if you look at the latest data 2 weeks ago from the Indonesian government, one part of Indonesia is 7 times behind another part of Indonesia in access to vaccines. So if there is vaccine inequity across the world, there is huge vaccine inequity in Indonesia that has been predicted by scientists. So with that, I just want to thank you, Jeremy, for bringing those issues and sharing your lessons with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gindo, and I second you about the vaccine inequity. And it's also been compounded by the infodemics, which influence how the community in some part of Indonesia accept the vaccine. There's a lot of vaccine hesitancy in some part of Indonesia, and that's also makes this vaccine inequity problem even worse. So we still have around 15 minutes times before Sir Jeremy leave this very, very prestigious event. So please, everyone who would like to ask or discuss about this book, you can raise your hand and we will have first 3 audience invited to ask your questions. No one? So
could I just come in?
Please, sir.
With a comment. Just to, I appreciate it's never easy to ask questions on these formats, but just picking up on those comments, I think another lesson I've learned is whether it's mistrust, malinformation, policy decision making, health systems, if you try and establish trust in a crisis, you'll always fail. If you try and build hospitals in a crisis, you'll be too slow. You won't. It's all about people. If you try and create a scientific evidence and advice into government in a crisis, you'll fail. What's absolutely critical in learning the lessons is we think, how can we put health capacity? How can we build trust within our communities? How can we ensure that scientific advice is listened to within government and better decisions made before a crisis? And then you will have that during a crisis that you can improve on and build on and learn from and change. But if you don't have it before a crisis hits, you will, I think, always struggle to develop trust, communication, scientific advice, politicians who can listen to advice. So biggest lesson I've learned again and again over the last 20 years is we must work on those things, not just in a crisis, but all of the time. Vaccine hesitancy comes from years of mistrust, not just the crisis.
Thank you, sir. Ada komentar kalau Bapak, sorry, I'm speaking in Indonesia so that if somebody who hesitate to speak in English can voice their comments. Bapak Ibu sekalian, apakah ada yang ingin bertanya? Jadi secara umum tadi kita bisa mendengarkan bahwa isu tentang pandemi itu bukan hanya isu kesehatan, ada beberapa dampak dari pandemi. Yang paling utama, yang pertama adalah di kesehatan, baik langsung maupun tidak langsung, tetapi juga kemudian ada dampak sosial ekonominya, dan pada akhirnya akan masuk ke ranah politik ketika kemudian berbagai macam terjadinya inequity akibat kemampuan masing-masing negara atau antar daerah itu menyebabkan situasi bertambah parah. Apakah ada komentar atau pertanyaan? I think everybody being too polite.
Yeah, I just like to.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, silakan, Mas.
Yeah, I'm Dimas Sumer. I'm a student from Universitas Gadjah Mada. My basic is a nurse, but currently I'm pursuing my health informatics at Karolinska Institute of Sweden. But my question is about inequity, because we do understand that the Western countries, they have like some kind like a closed circle, whether you can travel all around Europe without performing tests earlier, but now most of the restriction and limitation is lifted. But however, we found that the Western countries, yes, we do understand that those countries are limiting the infection rate by performing mandatory testing from people that originally from the low and middle income countries. Is it also called inequity or discrimination, or is acceptable within the whole world population. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, shall I answer? Or
Sure.
Okay.
Please.
So I do regard that as discrimination and equity. The UK at the moment has very, very good data, but it probably also has some of the highest rates of transmission in the world at the moment. 1 in 25 people walking on the streets today in the UK is infected. That's incredible. And frankly, it's been like that for months now. That's a government decision. There are many other parts of the world where the infection rates are very much lower. The risks are here. So to limit access here, it makes no sense. It's not logical. And I do believe that actually from December 2019 and the January of 2020 through to today, I'm afraid to say that countries, individuals, societies, communities have, as they often do in a crisis, become very insular. They've been fearful of people, I hate to say this, but people who do not look like them or come from somewhere else. This was true during plague in the Middle Ages. It was true in influenza in 1918, and it's been true in COVID. There was discrimination and, frankly, racism against Chinese scientists in January 2020, when the warnings and advice published in The Lancet on the 20th of January were not heeded. And people said, even people positions of power and influence in the UK said, well, that's China, that's not the UK. So I'm afraid that when you put a pressure on a system, I'm afraid many of the inequalities, the discrimination, the frank racism becomes more obvious within and between our societies. And I think that is something we must all reflect on as we take the lessons. And your example of traveling around Europe and limiting access depending on where you come from is an example of that.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. And Pak Gindo, you want to add something on that?
No, not on that one. I just want to give everybody a chance. If no one speaks, then I have a question.
I will also have a question to Prof. Jeremy. I think you will have the first time.
Okay, Jeremy, you mentioned the case of China, and you mentioned on one page the case of Dr. Guo's limit in responding to your question in January, that within the system that he's in, that's the best that he can do. The background, of course, China knew by the end of December, but within the system that Dr. Guo is working on, that probably is not supposed to be shared beyond. Now, my question is this: how should we design a system that will allow country to be incentivized when they can see incidents has global potential?
Yeah, this is a critical question. And of course, actually, when living in Vietnam 2004 and working closely with Indonesia in 2004 around H5N1 bird flu, this was an issue then. Actually, it was that issue, which frankly was phrased at that time in the question, why should we share our viruses and sequences of H5N1 if you'll just sell us back a vaccine we can't afford? And honestly, the world has never answered that question. And as we see vaccine inequity with, in the UK, 90% vaccine coverage, and in many parts, particularly of Africa, rates of 10 or 12%, we can see that that question of 2004 has never really been answered. Now, there have been changes made. The International Health Regulations makes a responsibility to every country to report issues of global significance within a time frame. That is something that effectively every country has signed up to and should honor. But unless we change the way we approach countries who then do that, and we incentivize it rather than providing disincentives and barriers and blame, then frankly, I don't think we're going to improve the situation. So when the Omicron variant came up in South Africa in November of 2021, there was a lot of blame attached to South Africa. Flights were stopped, trade was stopped, people were discriminated against. South Africa, it was called the South African strain. I even had social media and email comments asking whether the South African Omicron strain had been engineered and was a lab leak. I mean, you know, unless we change disincentives and blame to incentives and encouragement, I don't think we'll get to the change. The second thing I'll say, sorry to have a second answer, but I also think we need to appreciate it asked you a question. In Jakarta, a city of what, 10, 20 million people, you have 5 people with a respiratory infection in one hospital. You have 3 people in Litbangkes hospital. You have 2 people, children, in the pediatric hospital. You have 5 people in a private hospital in Jakarta. Would Jakarta be able to add all of those things together and say we've got an epidemic growing here? We wouldn't in London. I don't know in Jakarta. So I have some sympathy, actually, for the fact that, yes, I think China knew there was a cluster of infections and knew there was human transmission by certainly the 1st or 2nd week of January. But by the 20th of January, they had declared publicly by publishing in the Lancet and making it freely available to the World Health Organization that there was human-to-human transmission, asymptomatic transmission, and the full spectrum of clinical syndrome in the public domain by the 20th of January, 2020. The world knew. And yet most countries did not choose to do anything until the middle of March at the earliest. So the world did get the warnings it needed, maybe a week or 2 late, but not much longer than that. And it failed to act. So whilst, yes, I wish China had shared the information quicker. Yes, I wish China had been more transparent and open about the origins and the fact that my belief this comes from a wet market in Wuhan. And yes, absolutely true. But I think the West and the rest of the world needs to look at itself as well and ask why it did not respond when it had all the information it needed to know that this was going to be a very, very awful pandemic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeremy. Dr. Inke, you would like to ask something?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Pak Doni. And thank you, Jeremy, for the presentation and the talk. My name is Inke Lubis from Universitas Sumatera Utara, Medan. I actually spent about a few months in ORCID in 2012, where you were still in Vietnam. I don't know if you still remember me, but I had a very wonderful experience there. I'm now back in Medan for a few years already, and I'm also part of the COVID-19 task force, giving scientific input to the local stakeholder. But the problems that we have here, especially in places outside Java Island, that, for example, that we found that COVID-19 has affected Java, but the response done by the local government is quite slow, and also I think the support from the central government is also not as good as we expected. In March 2020, when we
can you shorten the questions, Dr.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, when it reported the first case in Jakarta, but it took about 4 months before North Sumatra received the first diagnostic test in Medan. So, I mean, we couldn't really control and make suggestions to do anything because we were not supported to prepare ourselves in the more in rural areas. But even I can say that Medan was actually the 3rd largest country in Indonesia. But even for the 3rd largest country, the support was very low. I cannot expect what is the support given for even like smaller cities and more remote areas. So with your extensive experience working in Vietnam and other countries, in developing countries, how would you suggest, like for us, especially from a smaller region, like a less advanced region, to get some more priorities from the central government? Because again, like in 2022 now, like the Omicron came in Jakarta, but like how we screen for Omicron in outside Java was not available until March, like now, like 2 months. So how do you, what is your suggestion for this? Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Sir Jeremy, before you answer, can I add on that? Because it's clearly the problem of inequity, and this is within the country. But again, in the global level, what will be the strategy? Because the government answers to their people. So how can we make into a global agenda where it's not only answer to the people, but answer to the humanity? And I think this is the big challenge ahead.
Yeah, this is the big challenge ahead, and Inka, it's very, very nice to see you. 2012 seems like so long ago, but very, very nice to see you, and great to hear that you're now based in Madang. I think this is the key question, and my view of it is that all epidemics, all health issues are essentially local, and so therefore a more devolved approach with local ownership and local investment to address local issues is much better than a highly centralized system. In Germany, which has a very federal structure, there have been problems about the balance between Berlin and the States, but nevertheless, there's been a very strong local ownership of decision making, and I actually am much, much more in favor of that. That would be the first thing. But that needs investment. It needs investment in people, in money, in institutions, and it needs investment in services, public services, which the community can trust. And the last thing I'll say is, although at the moment there's great interest in epidemics and pandemics, of course, through COVID, I think I would counsel to not focus all attention on epidemics and pandemics, but to focus attention on the things that matter to people today, tomorrow, next week, next month, whether that's epidemic diseases, endemic infections, non-communicable diseases, mental health. Focus on the things that matter to people all the time, and then have the resilience, the surge capacity to change and shift when something changes. Because if you set up new silos, new fragments to focus only on pandemics in the future, I can promise you they won't be there, they'll fade away, people will leave. And our job, our public service, is to provide people with health, with well-being, with education, all of the time, not just when epidemics come. I think that's the best way of building trust. I think it's the best way of building careers. I think it's the best way of getting long-term sustained investment into health systems, into education, into society and social structures than just having no money, no investment, no people, and then a surge which you can't use well because it only comes with once every so often. So my plea for the world would be invest in those health systems that we need all of the time. Invest in people, invest in trust and communication, and do so today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. And then when a pandemic, if it hits, we'll have the best chance of being able to respond to, and you will have the trust of communities in a way that otherwise you will not. Now, that's an idealistic, naive perspective, but I think that's what we must argue for.
Thank you, Sir Jeremy. I think that's the take-home message that we will have today, that we have to invest in health system, we have to invest in people, we have invest in trust and also communication, when we need to invest it continuously, consistently. So hopefully this will help us to adapt and also manage the next pandemic, because it's not the question of whether there is a new pandemic, but it's question when we will have the new pandemic. Thank you, Sir Jeremy. Thank you, Pak Gindo. I give the time back to the Master of Ceremony. It's been a pleasure to discuss with you.
Thank you very, very much. It's very nice to see old colleagues, or young colleagues, but from some time ago. I look forward to visiting Indonesia. I hope this year, if not next year. And I reiterate, you're all very welcome if you're in London to come and see us in London. So with that, my very best wishes. Thank you for the invitation. And I look forward to further discussions.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you, Pak Andono.
Thank you,
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bu Ni.
Thank you, Sir Jeremy, Pak Gindo, and Dr. Doni for the information and amazing inspiration about the Spike book. And thank you for everyone for joining today's sharing session. And I'd like to apologize if there are many mistakes from me as a Master of Ceremony during this webinar. Enjoy your day, and we'll see you again in another book review. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih, Pak Gindo.
Sampai
Terima
ketemu
kasih, Pak
lagi.
Gindo.
Ya.
Sehat selalu, Pak
Terima
Gindo.
kasih, Bu Ida.
Sehat selalu.
Pak Doni, sehat selalu. Terima kasih.